Mm, yeah, make this. All right, this recording, um, we're gonna have one shorter lecture today. This is the last one, and it's a collection of a few different things that I thought would be interesting to talk about in our last lecture. Um, and it involves a lot of cognitive control and integration. We talked about these different um, sensory and cognitive modules like vision and other uh, like motor area, and in a way maybe I mentioned that the auditory system kind of works similarly to the vision in a sense that there's a hierarchy of processing and everything, and it eventually leads to a cognitive task. Um, Today we're going to talk a little bit about the prefrontal cortex. And we haven't really talked about it that much so far, right? We talked about back of the brain. We talked about ventral pathway and dorsal pathway in the back of the brain. We talked about the temporal lobe being involved in object recognition. We talked about the parietal areas being involved in attention and neglect if there's a damage to it. We talked about motor areas. So it's just fitting that today we talk about the frontal areas. And the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe in general, relative to the rest of the cortex, have really grown as we evolve, as humans become, um, you know, part of this chain of evolution. So if you look at, for example, in the squirrel monkeys and cats and rhesus monkeys, they do have a prefrontal area and a frontal lobe, but you could see that relative to the rest of the brain, it has gotten larger and larger. Um, and and would appreciate if you it has gotten larger and larger. And you could and this has in a big part contributed to a lot of the cognitive abilities that we have, including language and cognitive control and planning and working memory and a lot of the stuff that was not possible with this small prefrontal cortex. Um, one, all right, let's talk a little bit more about the anatomy of the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is the biggest lobe compared to temporal, occipital, and parietal. It actually, the frontal lobe includes the motor areas that we talked about previously, where this is the primary motor area, this is the secondary motor area. But when you take those out of the frontal lobe, what remains, we call that prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex involves itself four different parts. We don't want to worry about too much about the anatomy of these areas. But but just know that frontal lobe includes the motor areas that we talked about in terms of motor planning and whatnot. But when people talk about the prefrontal cortex, this excludes the two motor areas. All right. So a lot of interest in motor area and its role again with a lot of different things that we talked about here. It has to do with some lesion studies, right? Or some natural lesion, right? A person, a lot of time it used to be like, I don't know, a gunshot wound or a war, injury or a construction injury. Those sorts of things had people initially thinking about what is the role of this area. Um, this is an example that was very popular for the frontal lobe damage. This guy was an exemplary worker, a well-liked man, but after his injury, his friend and he was no longer Gage. Um, and the reason is that he had a metal rod in a construction accident, I believe, going through his frontal lobe and damaging the whole thing. And after that, he became a reverend, indulging in the grossest profanity, which was not his custom. And he became very impulsive, and he did not show any restraint after that point. So cognitive control, the control part is really this sorts of being able to control your impulses, being able to think far ahead, plan far ahead, and um, and being able to integrate different types of information in order to make a decision. And the damage to that area, a lot of time damages this ability to like a lot of time this happens a lot with professional athletes, right? If you have football players, for example, repeated blow to the front of the head, especially over the course of years of doing this, and you're like, why would he make like there are famous cases like was it Aaron Hernandez or something? So where you're surprised, why would he make these choices? Why would he do these things, right? It's inconceivable. Why would anyone in their right mind would do these actions, would make these decisions? And the reason is that the frontal area is so damaged that it cannot plan ahead. It cannot, decide, like it cannot control your impulses. And this is where it comes from. Part of being to plan and control has a lot to do with working memory. You have to speak louder. It was a train like a tunnel construction. Mm-hmm. I see. Oh yeah, I think that's interesting, right? That he survived the whole thing. Yeah, I could imagine. Yeah, after some time we all die, I guess. Um, but I get your point that yeah. So this was part of a train, as you said, tunnel construction, and it the metal rod apparently exploded, and then he kind of went through his head, and he survived, and he became a like a subject in to it to his physician and others. Um, so we talked about working memory in a sense that it's the ability that we're able to maintain information and integrate information over a smaller period of time, like seconds up to a minute maybe. And we talked about in the context of humans remembering, a code or a number over a course of time. But you can imagine how important this could be for an animal if you're in an environment and you have to maintain certain information over time that, well, there is a predator here, or I'm hiding something right now. I have to wait for a little bit until I can walk this way or do this. So that sort of controlling and integrating information in that short time scale is really important. Here's an experiment. On the right side, it's an experiment that we discussed with long-term memory was it last week? So this experiment is, well, the food is always associated with a certain kind of um, pattern, you could always say, right? So in a way, you could say, well, sometimes they're matched to sample, sometimes they're non-matched to sample. So if in this case, for example, a cross had the food, you put the two things, there's still the cross has the food. So you're kind of uh, switching them. So here they're supposed to learn a long-term, say, association between a certain pattern with food. And a lot of time when they have a prefrontal cortex damage, they're still able to do this task. They're still able to associate this cross pattern with food. Now let's take a different task, a slight variation of this task, where there is no pattern on these cards. So the idea is that you have to maintain in your working memory which side of these things the food was there, right? And and when you have uh, uh, like you shutter it and then you open it and they have to pick the size that the food is there. In this case, this one had the food and this would be the correct answer. This task involved a lot more working memory engagement because the course of the trial, the monkey has to not only register whatever you put where the food was put, It has to maintain in its memory, okay, it is there, it is there, it is on the left side, it is on the left side, right? This is a maintenance of information. Now, again, if you have some semantic things, you could maybe associate it with it and it would be easier. But if you don't have a semantic thing, you have to remember, okay, this is the location of the food. And the example I use with the predator is an example like that, where you could say, well, I'm remembering that the predator was still behind that bush, and I want to maintain this to impact my decision, something like that. So monkeys that do have prefrontal cortex damage do show deficit in this task, which seems like an easy task, but it's difficult for them because it involves the maintenance of information. Is that clear, the experiments, what they did? Yeah.
Sandwich there, they can't plan ahead. How do those two correlate? Don't you think that you would know it like long term?
Well, I think that has to do with impulses, like controlling your impulses. We've all been, I don't know, we've all been in situations where you know what you're doing is like there is consequences to this event, right? I know that if I escalate this, there will be consequences. The better decision would be not to escalate it, but we still go ahead and escalate it. Why do we do that, right? I feel like children. So the thing about prefrontal cortex is that it is one of the last areas to mature in a human too, right? And that's why supposedly you don't want people to drink or smoke below a certain age because their prefrontal cortex is not formed yet completely for them to make rational decisions. And I think it has a lot to do with impulses, right? You control this impulse because you know, you could imagine all the consequences that this action gonna have. And you could, project back and not make that decision. And I think as I'm getting older, I'm becoming better at it, I think, in a sense. So I see that progression of, being able to control certain impulses and be more patient and all that. And I feel like all of that has to do with your prefrontal cortex maturing. The idea of working memory. So prefrontal cortex is huge. So it's not just one thing or two things, right? I said it's involved in the integration of information. It's involved in planning. It involves in projecting into the future to simulate what is the consequence of these actions, right? If I do something, I kind of have a simulation of what the consequence of this action is going to be. But all of those things involves manipulating information in your head. And that involves working memory. Does that make sense? So if I want to imagine, if I do this, if I go outside and if I walk home and I shop and this, that, all of those things that I'm simulating forward, that is core to planning, that's all in a working memory, right? That's what I mean. I should have said all of that earlier to make the connection between planning and working memory more clear. But yeah, I think because also a lot of these football players start young and then it's just not, it's not healthy to get repeatedly, get a blow in the head, I suppose. So what is the normal mechanisms here? Now, people have recorded in a task like this, but imagine a variation of this task, where you just have to maintain some information. And as soon as you get the go signal, you have to look to the right or to the left, right? For example, simple task. You get a cue in the middle that is red or green. If it's red, you're supposed to move your eye to something on the right side. If it's green, you're supposed to move your eye to the left side. Very simple task. How does so let's say the cue appears, it goes down. Now the monkey has to maintain the information that this was a red cue and I have to look to the left, right? This maintenance of information, that happens in the working memory. And you can imagine the simplest mechanism in the brain to do this would be for some cells to actually continually start firing and keep firing through sustained activity until I'm allowed to move, right? A lot of time what happens is that, well, you get the cue and you know what you're going to do, but then you get another cue that you have to wait until this cue down until you're allowed to make a movement. And monkeys, you have to train them for a few months to learn that task. But in a case like that, so imagine these are different trials. Every row is a trial. And you get a cue and you know what you have to do. Like imagine it's this task even. You're supposed to wait until you act. And then until you get the go signal, and where this upward arrow is on the right side is where the go signal is. And go signal is that. You get a cue, you know what you're supposed to do, you wait for a while, and then you get another cue, there's a go cue, and then you move where you need to go. And the go signal could come at any time, right? There is no set time for it. Sometimes it could come earlier, it could come later. And some cells happen to maintain activation all the way to the time that you get the go signal, and then they would stop being active. If there's a question online, you could just type it in the chat or something. I don't know. The best way is probably that. So this is what people thought. So again, going back to something I said earlier, there are only two things in the brain, right? What are they that you should worry about? Connections and activation. So when people thought, okay, we only have connections and activation, and now I have a working memory and I have to maintain something in my brain. So what would be the first idea to try? Well, what if there is sustained activation for that information, right? But there is an alternative way of doing this. And it could be what people call fast connections. So the two things that we have in the brain. What is a fast connection? I'm not going to go into it, but just so you know the theory. The fast connection is that sometimes in the brain, as you experience something, some connections get active, but for a very short amount of time. And then they go down to their baseline after the stimulus is gone. So the reason you see this sustained activity a lot of time could be because certain cells become very connected and they can maintain activity among themselves. And then when you're done with the task, those connections go down, and then you don't have a sustained activity anymore. Does that make sense? You could create a loop of activation by increasing the connections between the cells. But don't worry about it. The simplified manifestation of working memory, a lot of time for a lot of people who study this, is that in prefrontal cortex, in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, DLPFC, you'll find cells that have sustained activity for the actions that is already planned, but we're waiting to act upon. Does that make sense? And as soon as you act, as soon as you get the go signal and you go there, the cell stops being active. It doesn't need to maintain that information anymore in its sustained activity. So in working memory, you could use this experiment as an example task where you have to maintain information. And then imagine in this case, the food is on this side. The shutter goes down. Somewhere in the monkey's brain, in DLPFC, there are cells that are continually active to signal this information that the food is on the left side. They continually are active. And then as soon as the shutter goes up, as soon as you get this go signal, those cells become inactive, and then you act upon it. That's what it means. That's how a lot of people think working memory is implemented in the brain. And some of these cells people have shown that could be active up to a minute even, and that kind of tracks with what we talked about the duration of working memory a lot of time, how much you could actually sustain information. Okay, this was about working memory. I want to talk a little about consciousness and cognitive integration, because that's also really involved with the frontal area. So over the course of the semester, some of you would ask about consciousness and awareness, and I mentioned it in the context of attention and how related the two concepts are together. If I wanted to tell you what are the two main theories, scientific theories of consciousness right now, it would be these two. One is the global neuronal workspace theory, and the other one is information integration theory. So information integration theory says the level of awareness depends entirely on the complexity of the structure of shared information. That a lot of information is shared between the units, then there is a level of consciousness. What is the biggest criticism of this theory, you think? The second one here, and then we're going to spend a lot of time on the first one. But for the start, the second one says if a system is complex enough and there are entities that are interacting with one another, then you have a level of consciousness. Yeah.
I was reading about long-term hippocampal long-term potentiation, and there's some active concussion. Does that relate to the second one? Because that seems like it's important.
The long-term potentiation in hippocampus is related to the long-term memory formation. So
Right. Does it relate to these theories of consciousness?
I wouldn't say so. You could be conscious without a hippocampus, like the example we saw last week, right? The patient HN was his name. He was conscious without a hippocampus. The problem with second theory is that it promotes a form of panpsychism. Like in a way, it says any system that has a certain level of complexity of shared information should be conscious. So any system, right? This laptop is shared. There are components in it that are sharing information with one another. Any system, in a way, would have some degree of consciousness, and for that reason, people don't like it. The first theory, and it becomes more important when I say sharing information and stuff like that. The first theory, the global neuronal workspace theory, says that awareness requires the sharing of information among prefrontal, inferior temporal, occipital regions of the cerebral cortex. Now, it's making a claim about how consciousness emerges in the brain. Like, what are the mechanisms for consciousness to emerge in the brain? All right, let's look at it more, because I think it's important for understanding the frontal area as well. So, as I was saying, we looked at, for example, perceptual systems, right? We looked at vision, and I said vision is largely, at least in the first 100 milliseconds, is a largely feed-forward process. That you get an input, it goes through a system, and this is what it's supposed to show here. Now, there are some recurrence and feedback, and we talked a little bit about it, but don't worry about it. We talked about motor systems. Motor systems, you create a command through a distributed representation to move the hand in a certain direction. You have attentional system where you could attend to something or another thing. You have long-term memory, for example, and hippocampus being formed and other places. You have value systems, and I'm going to explain what those are. But these are basically the neurotransmitters that we talked about briefly, but I'll explain it more. Now, the idea is that all of these systems are competing to control the frontal area where the global workspace is. So the frontal area is connecting to all these areas, right? So the perceptual systems are in the back of the brain and the side of the brain for example, hearing. The motor area is up here. The attentional area is in the frontal parietal area. Long-term memory being in hippocampus and in cortex. So all of these other networks are feeding to this, what you call global workspace. And this global workspace is controlling the communication between them. So when you're conscious, you have a conscious perception, it ignites a network of distributed areas. Information which is selected for conscious perception gains access to additional computation. I'll unpack this, including temporary maintenance, global sharing, and flexible routing. And finally, measures of complexity, long-distance correlation, and integration of brain signals provide reliable indices of conscious perception. So, what are we talking about? When we are conscious of something, right? If I'm conscious of this table, I can answer questions about this table. I could tell you what color it is. I could move my hand toward it. I could act upon it. I could do a lot of things with that object, only if I'm conscious of it. So what consciousness gives you is a form of access, right? In a way, it gives this object access to the rest of the brain. It gives this object access to your memory modules. Now I remember that, for example, I have a table at home that looks like this, or I've seen this table in another room today, right? All of those things, all of those associations to be made, it has to be made through a distributed network of areas in the brain. So when you look at something, when it becomes conscious because it could connect to all of those things. It could connect to your prior memories of it. It could connect to other perceptual areas. You could ask me what sound it would make if you bang on it, and it connects me to other areas of my brain, and all those sorts of this stuff. I could sit on it, right? You could see that being conscious of an object, then it becomes something about how much of the brain, how much of the distributed brain network is preoccupied with that object. That's what consciousness is, according to this theory. And that is possible through this massive network that connects all these areas together, because it has to coordinate all of them, right? So if I'm attending to it, it coordinates all those things. It coordinates the connection to long-term memory. It coordinates connections to what value it has for me, and all of those stuff.
This specifically would just pertain to human cognition, right? Or can this be said to about other sort of animals I know?
I think it could be said about other animals. There's nothing about it. You could imagine a cat, and a cat is walking here, and when it attends to that, for the cat, it has the value of being able to jump on it, right? And that's only possible if they're conscious of it. They could measure the dimensions and the height of it, and then decide, okay, this is the action I want to make. So that table gains access, like they become, again, there are two ways to talk about this, and I'm saying it in both ways. But when the cat becomes conscious of that table, it means that that table becomes accessible to them in a sense that they could now act on it. I think in a way, that's what I'm trying to say. And the similar things could happen in the cat brain. The reason they're able to act on it is because, well, if the visual information is perceived, and those go to the frontal area, and they get distributed to the motor area, and then the motor area can execute the right command to jump on. So yeah, it's not limited to human experience. So according to this theory of global neuronal workspace, you do have a network. And you could imagine that these extremities of these networks are this stuff that we were looking at here, the perceptual areas, the motor areas, value systems, long-term memory stuff. Long-term memory here, again, these parcellations are almost always are arbitrary, meaning that, well, there's long-term memory. When I recognize an object, there's long-term memory in my perceptual system too, right? It's not, how else would I recognize it? It must be there. So it's supposed, so don't worry too much about that. This is just a schematic. Anyhow, so we have this big network of areas, and they're connected to one another. But you can imagine the global workspace being in the prefrontal cortex is connected to all of them densely. So when an object or a perception takes hold of the frontal area, then it would be distributed. It would be sent to all the other areas, because it's such a big network. And then if it reaches that point, then all these connections that are leaving that area are going to influence the activation in all the other areas. So if you are conscious of something, then it would reach. So for example, if I'm conscious of this mouth, then it would reach my, prefrontal area, and then it gets distributed to all those areas. Then I could move my hand toward it. I could do, other stuff with it. Now they make a distinction between conscious and two other mode of interacting with object. One of them is pre-conscious, and one of them is subliminal. Now the distinctions they make is that sometimes, I'm going to show you a paradigm first. So a paradigm that a lot of people use to study consciousness is like masking. Masking is you show an object. In this case, we're going to look at letter. And then a mask comes on it. Now, if there is no mask, then when you look at an object on a white background, it's going to have an after image. I don't think we talked about after images, but it's not going to go away quickly just because it, because when the object goes down, or after image that you continually see and you can perceive them, in order to limit the processing, you have to mask it. So let's look at this.
Who reappeared?
So, wait a second. This wasn't, so for example, the first one is not masked. So the letter comes up, it goes down. And then, so you could say what it is. A, right? Now we're going to see masked ones and you see the difference. For example, so what was that? Right? So it was displaying for the same amount of time, but because after that a mask came up, it limits your processing. It cannot just go on forever. So it kind of washes the whole sensory input in some ways. Look at this one. Again, very difficult. This one, E. So there was a distance between, there was a time distance between the letter and the mask. So you had enough time for that letter to reach your consciousness. Does that make sense? Before that, before the letter reached your consciousness, it gets drowned out in the other visual input that was on the mask. So this was the one we looked at, I think. Oh, no. This was also easier, I think, like N, because there's a distance between the letter and the mask. So imagine these experiments. Imagine these are the experiments that we're using. Now, in this case, you were attending to the object, right? You were not, it was not unattended. So, if there is no attention to an object, they're calling this subliminal. If there is attention, but there is a mask coming right after that, it's pre-conscious. Because you know there was an object there, right? So it's like, I see something there, but I don't know what it is, like before the mask. That's pre-conscious. And if the case where you saw the letter and you recognized it, that's a conscious because you were attending to it. So in this experiment, when they say T1, T1 is the case where you saw the letter and it became conscious. Whether it's unmasked or masked stimuli, but it's attended, right? What you see is that in the case of T1, you see activations distributed across the whole brain. So this is evidence, they take that as evidence for this ignite idea, where when you were conscious of it, there was distributed activation across the whole brain. But in the case of T3, which you were not attending, like it was subliminal, you see only activation in the back of the brain. And this is where the visual input is. All right. In this case, T2 is when there is no attention. Sorry, did I say this was attended? All right, let's go with this. T2, which is pre-conscious, there is no attention, and this is higher strength. So let's say T2 versus T3. This is unmasked. The terminology is crazy here. Unmasked versus masked stimuli, both unattended. So if you're not attending to it, if the stimuli is not masked, then you see some more activation versus when it's masked. So This is a case of, let's say, inattentional blindness. So in the case of inattentional blindness, there is no mask and you're not attending. So for example, take the example of the gorilla example, and that you didn't see. Imagine you didn't see the gorilla, some of you saw it, but imagine you didn't see it and you were attending to the people who were passing the way. The gorilla activation will be in your primary visual area because it's on the screen. You're not attending to it, but there is some activation in the back of the brain corresponding to that gorilla feature. So that's what this is supposed to show. That the object was unmasked, but you were not attending to it. Versus object that is masked, then you see some activation in the back of the brain. That's
The gorilla would be like T2, and if there was another person who looked like a human walking by, T3.
so T3 has to be masked apparently according to this theory. So sorry, this
Right.
is such a
So
terrible
what I'm saying is,
terminology. Yeah,
The terminology is so unclear.
yeah.
If it looked like 5 people in basketball shorts, and a 6th person side, that would be T3, and is not attentive to it, and it is masked because it looks like a basketball player. The gorilla is obviously looking different, so it's unmasked.
Possibly, yeah. I could see that. But no question, sorry. Uh-huh.
Totally conscious that there's a gorilla there, but once someone said, you see the gorilla.
Do you think you would be able to say that you saw the gorilla?
But then.
I don't think that ever do people, I don't think people can go back and be like, yeah, I saw gorilla. Almost never.
False memory.
Yeah, but that would be a false memory then. It wouldn't be something that is accessed. But I don't think they would have if inattentional blindness really works, then it usually is the case where people cannot be like, yeah, I saw the gorilla. Oh yeah, I saw a gorilla. I don't think that works. Yeah.
Is, just so I can kind of, I guess, walk you through terminology, so,
Mhm.
like, what I'm understanding from the way you're sketching all this out is that essentially with, if you abide by this theory, there's a sense that things that fall under T1 have the, like, exert the most influence and control over all the systems, whereas they're proposing that whether it's preconscious or subliminal, that there's less influence because there's less activation.
Yeah. So, or the activation is limited to a certain part of the brain. It usually is limited to the back of the brain.
Right.
So in this case, and there's a lot going on here and all, but let's say it looks like they're making a distinction between whether you have a top-down attention and whether the bottom of the stimulus is strong. And the way they manipulate the bottom of the strength is by how quickly the mask comes on. So if the mask comes on immediately, then it would be a weak bottom of the stimulus and then so-called interrupted. And if the mask is later, it's stronger. So they're saying this corner is the conscious corner where you're actually attending to it, and also it's strong enough. And that would be the letter that was, the mask came later, but you were attending to it and you were able to do it. This is the conscious corner. The preconscious corner is when you are not attending, but the stimulus is strong enough. And this is the gorilla, I would imagine, case. The inattentional blindness, because the attention is absent, but the stimulus is strong enough. The subliminal ones are when whether you're attending or not doesn't matter in this case, because the mask comes on so quickly that even if you're attending to it, you're not going to be able to recognize it. So that's the subliminal. I have like 3 slides left anyway, so just do it. Cool. Assuming 2 minutes. So online, what was the last slide you saw? Was it the value network or someone can tell me?
Yeah, I think that was the last slide that you showed, but
Okay, I'll restart there then. I'll restart from the value network. Thank you, Olivia. Oh, it's back to recording. Oh, or
Yeah.
okay. But then I would have to have the option of stopping this recording, but I don't have the option. How is that possible?
Are you joined as the host?
I have the option.
Oh, maybe different host.
You became the host?
Yeah, I'm not sure how that happened.
It probably assigned you,
Yes.
we dropped off.
Can I take back? So,
Yeah.
okay, let's see if I share my screen and then see if I have the option to be able to pause it, pause recording, stop recording. All right, hopefully it's the continuation of that or a new one I could share. So this is everything is in good shape. All right. So this is what I was describing earlier as the value networks. And the value networks are important because they have a wide, very distributed effect on different brain areas, right? If certain type of neurotransmitters is released in a distributed way, it could really change the way that different areas are communicating with one another. And it could, and the animal could learn, right? These networks also learn, okay, this is danger. Let's release all the, make the animal super alert. And so we could get out of here or be more careful. So this happens to us too, right? In different environment, we see there's a distributed effect of the release of these neurotransmitters that could really impact our responses. And they could really change the learning. They could change a lot of different things. We're not going to be able to get into it, but just know that these are really important for, again, you can imagine in cats or in animals, how important it would be to have these networks in order to connect the important things together to this core that is, or blackboard or whatever they call it, or workspace. back in the day, they used to be called the Blackboard model, but now they call it the workspace model for some reason. And how important it is to connect all of those things to the workspace in order for them to be conscious of what's really important. That's really all I wanted to say about value networks, so you know what they are. The last thing I wanted to say about consciousness is this idea of what's called blind sight. Blind sight is the concept that they have observed in people where we talked about neglect, for example, right? People are neglecting something in their environment because they have a parietal lobe damage. Blind sight is different in a way that the damage is earlier in the visual area. It's in the primary visual cortex. And if the damage is in the primary visual cortex, people are aware of it. People know there is a hole in their visual field. But what they observe is that sometimes these people are able to answer questions about it, even though they are not they have no experience of it. So the experiment that people have done is something like this. So you use an eye tracker to know where the eye is, and then using that eye tracker, and these are really accurate eye tracker. These are called dual Purkinje image eye tracker, and they put something in the eye. It's really involved, but they're very accurate. They know exactly where you're looking. And if they know where you're looking, they could move the image to make sure that the object exactly appears in where the blind spot is. So the blind spot in this patient could be this area in the right visual field because they have a damage down here. And because of that, they could make sure that they place an object right in there. And if you move your eye, the objects would move with your eye because, as you all know, when you move your eye, your visual field moves, and you have to move the object in order for the object to be connected to the same brain area that is damaged, to fall in the receptive field of the same cells that are damaged. So in this case, they are doing this experiment. It's a simple experiment. For example, here you could say, well, are these two the same object? Well, one of them is in the blind spot, the other one is not. And people are supposed to say, I don't know, I'm not seeing the other object. But if you force them to make a choice, if you tell them, no, you have to answer, a lot of time you see that they're above chance. They're above the 50% chance level that there is there, right? So what it tells you is that sometimes the information could kind of bypass your visual information through other pathways. And these through other pathways or through a very diminished visual cortex, you know, the underlying mechanism is also debated, but people have taken this as, for example, philosopher Ned Block, who works at NYU, they've taken this as evidence for the difference between sentience and access to information. Sentience in the sense being, okay, am I having an experience of this? Am I experiencing this apple in my right visual field? Maybe I'm not, but if you force me to say if that object is similar, the same as the other object, then I'll give you maybe above chance response. So that means that I have access to that visual information somehow without having an experience of it. And blind sight is argued a lot in consciousness research. If you ever go to a consciousness conference, and it was coined by a researcher at Oxford University that called this people who had suffered a lesion in their primary visual cortex that responded to visual input presented in that blind spot, right? So if they're able to respond to that, it means that they have access to that information but do not experience it. But they have a feeling, you know, they're like, oh, based on my feeling, I would say they're the same object, but I don't know why I have that feeling. Something similar, you observe that with people who have a split brain. So people who have cut, you know, the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres of the brain. And if you cut that, then they show really strange, or what would not be understandable by people who don't have that, is that, for example, they could see if you put objects in different, so if they're fixated and they have different objects appear at different sides, sometimes they're not able to see one object sometimes, right? Because if it's really flashing or fast. But if, let's say there are words and your left brain is better at recognizing words, you're able to recognize this one. And if there's an object on the right, the word, you may not recognize it, but if someone asks you to draw it, then you're kind of able to draw it. It's like these sorts of behavior that you see, in a sense that there is some access to that information, but not in the typical way that we're used to seeing. So this is, the blind side is an example of that a lot of people use to study consciousness, and they argue whether, oh, what is the experience separate from the content and all those sorts of things. Any questions about this? This is all, yeah,
I have a question on the,
sure.
the next slide. On the bottom, is one of those T2? I thought
Yeah.
that T2 and T3 didn't reach the front of the brain.
No, this is the green one. Everything that is green is all this T1. And this is seen stimuli bigger than missed stimuli. So these are all the areas where T1 had a higher activation than T2. So that's what it means. Like you just say, you look at the fMRI activity in the whole brain, you look at when it was T1, where you saw it, when it wasn't, and then you say, okay, which areas this one has higher activation than that one? And those are the ones involved in conscious experience, for example. It's just, so in this case, is T2 bigger than T3? So these are all the cases where you had a pre-conscious experience, so where you attended to it, but you didn't, wait, no, this is the one where you didn't attend. This is the case of the gorilla example, right? No attention. So the gorilla was walking by, but you were doing another task. You were not attending to it. But where are the brain areas that are active during that experience, but they're not active when you mask an object? And when it's subliminal. Subliminal is when you mask it or otherwise. And these are the areas that would be active in the in attentional blindness case, because your visual input is processing that information. This is still in the back of the brain. And when the gorilla walks by, your back of the brain is processing that information. It's just that you're not attending to it. So that's T2. And these are all the areas, the back of the brain, where T2 would be more active than T3, which is subliminal, which is so weak that it's not even activating your back of the brain, kind of. Or maybe doing it a little bit, something like that. So I guess these are different degrees, and that's why they showed it like this. I can go back to the paper. That's why they're showing it like this. The case of conscious, which is the green in that figure, again, the color coding is not also consistent, but imagine the green case, it would be the whole brain, back of the brain, front of the brain, parietal area, they're all connected in a dynamic, network. But in the case where the second case we saw there, which is this one, you're not attending to it. So this is this case, no attention, absent, but the signal is strong. So this is the gorilla example. You see more spread activity versus the cases where you're attending or not attending, but the signal is so weak that the activity is really limited. So I think a lot of it, so when people study, for example, consciousness in sleep, they show similar thing where the connectivity is much more local. So it's not like there's not a complex spatial temporal coordinated behavior in the sense that you would see in a conscious brain. So this locality is a big part of consciousness argument, where the activity is localized to that modality rather than it being a more global coordinated activity. I should have used this picture instead. I don't know why. Here's the other picture. It's more informative. Okay. Any more questions? Any questions online? Let's see if I do.
Brain conservation looks like one side.
With blindside, there are some evidence that uh, there are some evidence that there is some very small activation. So imagine there's a patch of the brain that is supposedly lesion or dead. There's some small activation in those areas when people record from them. It's not that it's severely damaged, but there's some little activation that signals the input. It's just not strong enough for it to form, become part of that coordinated, I guess, frontal area guided activation. Some people argue that, well, the activation is much more limited to subcortical areas. So we talked about another pathway, for example, in the brain going through the superior colliculus and subcortical and Holvinor and others. And they're saying that pathway is not conscious. So if it's going through that pathway and then because those areas are then projecting into the rest of the cortex, you still have access to the information without having an experience of it because it's not part of the cortex. It's debated. I don't think there's a definite answer to it, and it's different from person to person.
I guess, I don't know if this is related, but, or I guess my question is, in thinking about blindside, is that, can we kind of tie that to how we think about how people experience, like, I guess, ghost limbs, and how maybe you don't necessarily have, right, the immediate experience of tactile sensation, but you can sort of, you still, in some way, like, I guess maybe it's kind of an version of it, where you have the experience, but you don't actually have the information. Or
I think the problem with phantom
Okay.
limbs is that so this is a case, let's say someone had an injury or an accident and they amputated the leg or the hand or some other extremity, right? And then what happens is that that brain area is associated with the hand, for example, right? But all these sensation is gone, all of it. And what happens to that brain area, a lot of times it gets recruited by the neighboring areas. So, for example, we talked about the hand area is closer to the face, right? So sometimes but you still think that it comes from your hand, so you misclassify that sensation. For example, if you touch your face, you may think it's coming from your hand, and some people, some veterans, like if they're shaving and they think maybe their hand is feeling something, it's because it's recruited by other areas and other sensory inputs modulates the same pathways, but you still misclassifies it as coming from the hand that doesn't exist. Something like that. But it's different. It's different. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna stop recording. Are you sure you want to stop recording?